I am determined to make this one a short video. In this case, now sometimes there will be short videos or none at all if the readings are really clear. In this case, the Aristotle virtue ethics doesn't have the kind of detail or rigor that the others do, so I really just need to get you used to the language and the perspective, and you'll see that will actually be a little bit of a fault of this moral theory, that it is not very specific. It doesn't promote the kind of strict obligations that other moral theories will be able to. All right, so first, just let me say something as a little bit of a preface, that this reading, I know the language is fairly friendly, but it is written in a very strange style. What this is Aristotle is writing in the same way he would teach. And teaching in Athens was a fairly different enterprise than what it would be here. He expected his students to have incredibly good questions, to know all of the literature he was talking about. And so this is more like recording a lecture than writing a book, right? So the idea is the students are supposed to be filling in the gaps of what is in this reading. So I almost think it reads as if you're borrowing someone else's lecture notes, right? It's kind of repetitive, and it seems to skip over some detail we need. But anyway, right? So it's not just you. This reading is a little awkward. All right. If we were to make this into a little fortune cookie saying, you would say that Aristotle's virtue ethics would define the right action as the act that the virtuous person would do. That is incredibly unhelpful, right? So there's the punchline, but we have to make sense of it. Now first, back up and let me paint the basic story of what's going on here. Now, we have already seen utilitarianism that defines right and wrong based on the consequences of an action, right? So that's nice and handy. You just need to figure out a way to measure the value of actions, measure these consequences, and so utilitarianism, Mill's version, weighs pleasure as a way to understand happiness. Now, another common moral intuition we have is that we use intention. What was the person's intent when they were doing the action? And that's a good way to also tell if it's right or wrong. Now, we will look at that theory when we get to Kant. So those are the two ends of our normal intuitions. Aristotle here is focusing on the character of the person. Now notice, intuitively, this does matter to us. Yes, the behavior itself matters and the consequences matter. Those are fairly obvious. Intention matters, but notice, we do care about the character of the person who does an action. I mean, let's say a serial killer helps an old lady across the road. We would say, okay, we could check their intention and it's good, but we still don't want to praise that sort of action because they killed the very next old lady that they ran into a block further on. You would say, yeah, that's an isolated good action, but we don't want to praise it because the character of that person is terrible. Do you get the idea? Good. So, unpack the punchline. The act that the virtuous person would do is the right thing to do. So first, let's unpack what virtue is. I mean, this is a virtue ethic. The word virtue simply means excellence or to excel. And so to say someone is virtuous is very morally vacuous. There's not much content there. It simply means they excel at something. So you could excel as a good citizen, or you could excel as an axe murderer, an artist. And notice, these would have very different character traits. If you're looking at the virtuous person, you are simply talking about the person who, in a given practice or in a certain activity, excels, is very successful. An analogy here would be a saying that I really dislike. It is when we use the word good in a very vacuous way. Like when we say, oh, he is a really good lawyer. Well, what does that mean? It could mean they're the most despicable human being on the planet, but they win a lot of their cases no matter how despicable they are. Well, there's the idea. To say something is virtuous or has virtue is fairly neutral in its moral terms. It just means to excel, succeed, so on. All right, so next step. We talk about character traits, and so now we can talk about what is a virtue. Not virtue in general, but what is a virtue. And when we apply this to human beings, we are talking about character traits or personality traits. So you can think of an object being excellent and it has these certain traits or properties that make it so. Well, in ethics, it's easier to talk about these are character traits that tend to produce excellence. So if we were talking about an excellent basketball player, we could say, what virtues does that player possess? And so we would think, okay, look, she has height, she has speed, she has agility, she's quick thinking. If we got really detailed, we would say she has good form on her jump shot, right? She dribbles without thinking much about it. Ambidextrous, that would be another virtue that would help a basketball player. But you get the idea. And then we could look at a nurse, and we could say, oh, there's a virtuous nurse. And we would ask, what are the virtues, what are the particular character traits that make that person a good nurse? And so we could say, oh, look, he's patient, right? He's technically knowledgeable. He's very sympathetic. He's good at listening, can handle a lot of stress, has a good attrition rate, doesn't get tired easily. We incredibly overwork our nurses in this society, but so we can say these sorts of things. So now we're ready to take the next step for Aristotle. The goal here is to become a virtuous person so that we can do the right action. Well, to become a virtuous person, you need to acquire those traits that will help you promote excellence in whatever your practice or activity is. In this class, we're hoping the activity is a good citizen, a good human being, a good friend. We'll talk. But we've got to stick to the text, and the text is very general so far. So, how do you acquire a virtue? So if I want to be a great nurse and I want to acquire patience, let's say, if you think that that is a key trait that helps you become a better nurse, then that's one of the traits you're going to want to acquire. How do I acquire this? All right, so look at Aristotle. Go to page 1. I'm going to look at roughly the last, say, 12 lines of page 1. Let's go. Virtue of character, i.e. of ethos, revolts from habit. Hence its name ethical slightly varied from ethos. Just means practices, cultural norms or something. We learn a craft by producing the same product that we must produce when we have learned it. We become builders, for instance, by building, and we become harpists by playing the harp. Similarly, then, we become just by doing just actions, temperate, that means having self-control, by doing temperate actions, brave by doing brave actions. Now, here is the key. So far, you shouldn't see this as very helpful. How do you become patient? By being patient. I mean, that is good wisdom, but we need more help. So now look what he says, right near the little section 6. Further, the sources and means that develop each virtue also ruin it, just as they do in a craft. For playing the harp makes both good and bad harpists, and it is analogous in the case of builders and all the rest. For building well makes good builders, and building badly makes bad ones. Let's give an analogy here. Let's say that I want to become good at guitar. I am not, by the way, but let's say I wanted to be good at guitar. And we would first talk about building up the different virtues, right? Hand-eye coordination, learning my chords and all of these things, right? Maybe being ambidextrous or whatever. But so, what we are doing to acquire these traits is habituating them. Doing them over and over until they become normal for us, until we become so practiced that they are effortless. You get the idea. But here's the key. What he's getting at is they are both the way to promote them and ruin them. Get it? If I wanted to be a really bad guitar player, I could do it in 2 ways. One would be to never learn how to play guitar at all and just hand me a guitar and see how I do with no practice whatsoever. You would say yes, right? You would have to be some freak of nature to just be instantly good at guitar without practicing. Good. But his point, there is a second way to become really bad as a guitar player. What is that? Practicing terribly. You can practice, but if all of your practice is awful, you will habituate terrible practice. So for instance, in my case, when I moved to Chicago, I grew up as a surfer. When I moved to Chicago, I decided, you know what, I'm going to make basketball my new thing. I'm going to try to devote myself to basketball in my free time. Well, what happened? I practiced and practiced and played a lot, and my jump shot wasn't getting any better. I practiced and practiced and seemed to get worse, or at least no better. Why? Because my shooting form was awful. I didn't really realize that I was doing it wrong, but my finger was in the wrong place on the ball. I wasn't directing the shot with mostly these two fingers. My elbow wasn't in front of me or directed at the basket. I was tweaked. I was shooting mostly sideways, shooting off these two fingers. Just mechanically, everything was wrong. So the more I practiced, the more habituated I became in shooting terribly. That's the point. All right. So far, we've got the basics, not too deep. We need to develop the right virtues by making them a habit. The next problem should be quite obvious. How can we know we are practicing well or practicing poorly? I mean, a lot of you would say, well, you just go look up videos to see what good shooting mechanics are. Yeah, that doesn't help if you're not sure who the good teacher is. And how do you find the good teacher? You can't go by clicks or views. Some of the most stupid videos on YouTube are the most watched. Some of the stupidest advice at very important things, medicine, health, are absolutely wrong, but people are mistaken in thinking they're good. So, we need more help, Aristotle. If we are going to become good people, we need to habituate the right virtues. But how can we do that? How can we be sure we're not practicing patience poorly and so become the worst nurse ever? All right, so now turn to page 2, and this is technically the 4th paragraph, the little section 6 thingy. Sorry. First, then, we should observe that those sorts of states naturally tend to be ruined by excess and deficiency, too much and too little. We see this happen with strength and health, for we must use evident cases such as these as witnesses to things that are not evident. For both excessive and deficient exercise ruin bodily strength, and similarly, too much or too little eating or drinking ruins health, whereas the proportionate amount produces, increases, and preserves it. Is that clear? No, right? I mean, yes, it's a basic trait that virtuous actions have that they tend to be, not always, but they are often moderate. So yes, eating, exercise, sure. Should I run out right now and jog an ultramarathon? No, I would die. Should I stay home and never get any exercise outdoors at all? No, that would be terrible for me as well. I would become a sedentary big fatso and probably die of heart disease at a young age. Anyway, so we would say be moderate in your consumption, in your exercise, in your sleep, in your activity. Sure. But does that mean this is good advice all the time? No, of course not. Because a lot of things don't admit of moderation. Some things should be done almost all the time, and some things should never be done. Let's see. I'm thinking of murdering people. I think murdering a few people would be too little. Murdering 100 people would be too much. So let's say about 10 to 12 people would be a moderate attempt at murdering. No, you get it, right? Should I be deceitful all the time or just a little bit? No, I should be deceitful half the time. No, right? There are bad things that don't admit of moderation, and moderation takes a lot of know-how to judge correctly, right? Food intake, sure, I shouldn't eat a whole turkey by myself, right? But does that mean eating half of a turkey is right? No, right? You get this thing. So this is a very kind of vague advice. But Aristotle has one more shot at this. All right, so remember, we're trying to acquire the right habits so that we can be excellent at whatever our practice is. Got it? So go to page 4, second line. Hence, actions are called just or temperate when they are the sort that a just or temperate person would do. We're right back at the beginning. But the just and temperate person is not the one who merely or just happens to do these actions, but the one who also does them in the way in which just or temperate people do them. What? I mean, this is like a conversation like having good style. Yeah, you know when people have no style, but how could you describe someone that has style? It's different in different circumstances. So far, but you get the idea. It is the person, the character type of the person that does all of the work, but we are novices, so we need more help. Go further. So skip to the third paragraph on page 3, the final page. But having these feelings at the right times about the right things, toward the right people, for the right end, and in the right way, is the intermediate and best condition, and this is proper to virtue. Whew. Okay, do you see this? So, we need to not only do the virtuous action, we need to do it as the virtuous person would do it, with their kind of mindset and their kind of attention to detail and context. Okay. So what are we left with? We are left with a lot of character homework, for lack of a better word. The onus is on us to find the virtuous person and figure out what traits to imitate and how to imitate them. Being moderate is not that helpful, so the core seems to be, here's the gist, imitating a virtuous person. You've just got to find them. Now, if we are really careful and not easily deceived by the internet especially, we can, if we look around, we can find virtuous examples. If you are a nurse, you can go among your coworkers and see, now that person has really a lot of success with these things which are key to me. Making the most money? Nope, that is not the key to being good at your craft. But you could see their patients do well. Their patients seem to be more comfortable and at ease than others. Maybe we could even check health outcomes. Basketball, there are some key indicators if that's what you're trying to do. You can look and see, wow, that person has a good handle. They make almost all of their jump shots. They probably have the kind of traits I need to imitate, and then you need to do your homework and find them. But so for our interest, what are we looking for? We're looking for good human beings, good friends, good citizens, good classmates. I mean, this is the kind of ethical behavior we are talking about, and that's what I'm going to focus on. One key here is that most of us have a few different life roles. The first pitfall is if you are trying to habituate certain character traits that make you just a good person, a good friend, a good parent, a good son, whatever these are, well, some character traits carry across the board. Being kind, being sympathetic, being honest, probably. Now notice, one of the worst things you could do if you're following Aristotle's program here would be to have a bunch of conflicting life roles. I mean, could you imagine being an assassin and then a parent? I mean, sure, they're both probably patient, right? But the character traits that are going to make you good at one and good at the other are going to conflict. I mean, being very cunning and getting away with lying and misrepresenting yourself all the time. No. So, key thing, sorry, but you got to avoid conflicting life roles. If you want to be a good teacher, you probably shouldn't be a deceitful real estate agent. So those aren't the kind of traits that make you good at different things. A second key thing that we will need to do is to probably need to forge a hybrid sort of role. Or what would you say? Make a composite of the best character traits you see in the people that excel at what you are trying to excel at. If you are trying to excel at nursing or being a good father, you could probably look around and see the traits that, well, that guy is a good father because of these traits. He's not perfect, though. He's not perfect either. He has these traits. I know. I'll combine the two. I'll imitate his patience. I'll imitate his integrity. And we can create these kind of composites and try to habituate those different skills until they become ingrained. So to summarize the advice we have, it is we got to talk about two different levels. Notice, in the ideal situation where you have spent your time habituating the right virtues, you excel at the kinds of roles that you play, notice, to do the moral thing, you just do what you would naturally do. You are a virtuous person, so the right action is what you would naturally do, following your best practices and habits. But notice, if you're not a virtuous person, what you need to do is do the thing that the virtuous person would do. In other words, imitate virtuous people, or imitate that composite person that you created in your mind, and do those things. And you do them until they become a habit, and then you won't have to imitate anymore because you will simply be that good person. Now, going back to what we were saying, how it's very critical of divine command theory, well, this is one way to have a very good religious ethic. It would be imitating the kinds of virtues that the great religious teachers have until they become a habit and you become like this. Great verse. One of my favorite verses is Romans 12:2. What does it say? It says, don't conform to the ways of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is. God's will is pleasing, perfect, and good. Right? Sorry, translations differ. I put a bunch of different translations together. But you hear the idea. This is kind of like that "what would Jesus do" ethic that was popular, a handful, a dozen years ago. And the idea is you become this new person, and then you will naturally do the kinds of good and perfect actions that, in this case, a Christian or whatever religious adherence you have, that kind of person would do. That's a virtue ethic. And then I would just tack on to this my ideas about what I think a good citizen or what just a good human being in the world would be. And so I would just kind of add this broader picture so that this doesn't seem so relative. Because in my view, whatever your practice is, it should align very well with just being a good human being or a good citizen or a good neighbor in our society. So if they eradicate conflict, so what would I include? I would include being kind, being fair, being sensitive, being honest, being intelligent, being informed, being self-controlled, right? Being able to do the things you want to do and not just be at the whims of how you're feeling every moment. I mean, these kinds of things. So let's do our test cases. Again, we'll try to do this with every moral theory. We'll try to look at and see what these moral theories would say about murder, suicide, lying, and abortion. Now, for Aristotle, if we are already the virtuous person, by the way, you're not, I'm not, but that's the idea. If you were, you would just think whatever you think of these and they would naturally be right. Okay, that's hard for us. So we need to ask, what does the virtuous person do in these kinds of cases? Now, of course, it's going to be contextual, but does a virtuous person murder? No, they don't. But could you imagine the difficulty of the relativity of this? Well, what if my role is an assassin, or what if my role is a soldier or something? You would say, okay, well, the virtuous person might murder in certain occasions, but that's very far from the perspective I'm thinking of. We do not think of a generally good person as one that would murder. That doesn't fit. That doesn't constitute the kind of practice of being a good human being that produces excellence. I wouldn't want to live in a society filled with murderers. I don't consider those to be good people, but you get my point. Suicide. Would the virtuous person commit suicide? Is that an action we should imitate? It's going to be really tough. This is going to be the bigger kind of critique of Aristotle, because we don't have any overarching duties here. Now, if one of your roles is being a good parent, should you be committing suicide? No, not when you have children to care for. When you have other people that depend on you, and most of us do, suicide is not a virtuous action. That is not something virtuous people would do. But could there be situations in which we could imagine a virtuous person seeing suicide as the right sort of action? I guess, right? I guess we can imagine cases. Probably pretty rare, though. Lying. Now, in my own portrait of a good person should be a good citizen, a good member of society, lying would be incredibly infrequent, except in very particular contexts. Seems okay. Now, what if one of your roles was as a stockbroker, a real estate agent, an advertising executive? You would say, oh, that role requires lying to be successful and excel in whatever salary or things are used to measure. But again, so far afield to what I'm trying to do in this class. I want you to become genuinely good people that would fit in any sort of situation, not just in a very hypothetical one with a very different ethic. I mean, being a good lawyer, I hope you don't mean that in the most cunning and lying sense. Finally, abortion. Wow, that's up in the air. That really depends on the kinds of practice you're talking about. Now, could we imagine a good parent, a virtuous parent, right, recommending abortion or practicing abortion? We would say, well, it would depend, I guess. If this child it requires so many needs and requires a diversion of so many resources from other children, you're getting the kind of considerations that we would have here. But again, we can't really find concrete advice. We would have to create a radical composite of women, of mothers, to see what a virtuous one would do about abortion. And you, now sadly, not too many people talk about abortion in their personal experiences, but you might have some of these experiences. You might have a lot of virtuous women in your life that can really give good advice about what the best thing to do in the context of abortion is. All right. So finally, what is the major problem with virtue ethics as a moral theory? And we've seen it the whole time. Now, for fun, I call this the Homer problem. Now, if you're a nerd, you think Homer is referring to the author of the Iliad. And so it applies there in a little way. For instance, in the books of Homer, there are some very different virtues at play. Now, they had a very peculiar virtue, was to be very careful and caring and kind to the stranger. You see that in the Old Testament of the Bible as well. Are we very good at that in our society? No. Whenever the economy has a downturn, what do? We don't blame the banks or the deregulation of real estate markets. We blame immigrants, right? Okay, no. But in Homer, so you had this one ethic, but another virtuous person in Homer's day was what was called the cunning person. This was actually the Odysseus's catchphrase, or how he had been introduced. Odysseus the cunning. And what did this mean? You are good at tricking people to get them to do what you wanted them to do. That does not make for a good citizen, a good neighbor, a good parent, a good friend. So one Homer problem is the idea of the relativity of context, and how to excel in one practice could make you a terrible person. Now, because I am a nerd, but even more immature, I mean the Homer problem in the fullest sense to also include the Homer Simpson problem. If you are Bart Simpson and you're trying to be a good parent or just a good worker or a good human being, it is going to be very hard for you because your examples are awful. I mean, what if you are raised by a bunch of Nazis, let alone Homer Simpson? It's going to be very tough for you to become a good person because your examples are going to be so terrible. And if you're thinking relatively, you're going to have some terrible examples that you're going to have to do a lot of homework to create a virtuous person you could imitate. That's the problem, the kind of subjectivity and relativism. Now, that makes this a moral theory that's very much at home with the way our society is today. People love subjectivity and relativism, right? That's just the status quo. People think there are no moral values. I believe whatever I believe. No, that's not how ethics work. That's not how logic works. That's not how the truth works. Fine. But you see the problem. The problem is this sort of deep relativism that it is very hard to tell what good is to make sure you're developing good habits to become a virtuous person. Okay, that was a mouthful. Thanks.